evening. My name is Yelena Keller, and I am the Curatorial Assistant of Exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I am so thrilled to be here with you all this evening and to welcome you to the Studio Screen program with the 2019 to 2020 Artist in Residence Elliot Reed and artist Jack Waters. Studio Museum's iconic Artist in Residence program offers artists an unparalleled opportunity to develop their practice while in residence over the course of 11 months and culminates in an annual exhibition featuring their work. This program is presented on the occasion of This Longing Vessel, Studio Museum Artist in Residence 2019 to 2020 culminating exhibition held at MoMA PS1. This Longing Vessel features the work of artists Elliot Reed, Nadine Pierre, and E. Jane, and was organized by Legacy Russell, Associate Curator, Exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem, Josephine Graff, Assistant Curator, MoMA PS1, and myself. This exhibition marks the second year of an ongoing partnership with the Museum of Modern Art and MoMA PS1 that sees the annual Artist in Residence exhibition take place at PS1 while the Studio Museum continues construction on its new home on 125th Street in the heart of Harlem. It has been such a joy to be in conversation with Elliot across many Zooms, phone calls, texts, and emails over the course of this last year as we have navigated this newly remote residency. What an honor it's been to watch Elliot's creative process evolve and flourish as his deeply intersectional and interdisciplinary practice continues to push the boundaries of what performance can be and to offer us new ways of seeing, experiencing, and being. This program would not have been possible without our phenomenal public programs team. Dayon Huff, Director, Public Programs and Community Engagement, Isa Hui Saldana, Studio Museum and MoMA Curatorial Fellow, and Cheyenne Marcano, Senior Coordinator, Public Programs and Community Engagement. To this end, I will pass the mic to Cheyenne, who will be our virtual guide through the evening to share some housekeeping information and some brief notes on the artists.
Thank you, Elena, and welcome everyone. My name is Cheyenne Marcano, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of Public Programs and Community Engagement here at the Studio Museum in Harlem. It's such a pleasure to see everyone tonight and a joy to celebrate Elliot. If this is your first time attending one of the Studio Museum's online programs, give us a thumbs up react or let us know in the chat. Each year, the Public Programs and Community Engagement Department works closely with the Studio Museum's Artists in Residence to develop a public program that allows for the museum's audiences to engage with their work. We're grateful to be able to share the next hour with you all in virtual space, thanks to the support provided by the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation's Frankenthaler Digital Initiative and Art Bridges, who have helped make the museum's digital programs possible. This program is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Studio Museum's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. If you'd like to disable your video, please click Stop Video in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. Closed captioning, generously provided by Steno Captions, is available by selecting the CC icon also located at the bottom of the screen. Please keep your microphone off. And lastly, we encourage you to watch tonight's program in speaker view by switching your viewing settings in the top right corner. Before I introduce our artist, I want you to know that the idea for this program was wholly conceived by Elliot himself, who asks that we lead with the premiere of a selection of new video works created during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. For the talkback, Elliot was keen to be in conversation about the videos with someone he described as a new media elder. Enter Jack Waters. Because Zoom can be clunky and unreliable when it comes to sharing video, we'll share a link in the chat to the museum's website where you can watch Elliot's videos for an optimal and smooth viewing experience. And there's no need to leave the Zoom room to watch the videos. In fact, we ask that you remain logged on here as you open the link to access the screening. The videos run about 10 minutes long, so once you're finished watching, you can simply close the browser where you were watching the videos and enjoy the conversation with Jack and Elliot that will follow here in the Zoom. Now, a brief introduction to the artist. Elliot Reed utilizes video, text, and sculpture as an extension of what it means to use his exact body, specifically a Black queer body, as material. His work in this longing vessel foregrounds the feeling, to quote Elliot directly from his essay titled In an Attempt to, of a quote, digitally reproduced body in pain. For 4 decades, Jack Waters has complicated and set forth alternative understandings of gender, sexuality, and desire through a multidisciplinary practice that encompasses non narrative, documentary, and personal history strategies. Elliot, Jack, before we watch the videos, give us 3 words that describe what it means to come together this evening.
Elliot.
Hey, Jack. Okay, I guess I'll go first. Hi, thank you.
Oh, you got muted.
Jack, those are Elliot's 3 words. Hi and thank you.
Yeah. Okay, that's one. No, that was funny. Beautiful, magical intergeneration.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Welcome back, everyone. You just watched Twosies and Internal Recreation by Elliot Reed. Both shorts, in addition to another one titled Quarantine Ballet, will be available for streaming on the Studio Museum's Watching This page starting tomorrow. We're also excited to include The Male Gaze, a signature piece by Jack Waters, on there as well. Before I hand things off to Jack for tonight's talkback, do feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat. There will be time for Q&A before the program wraps. Handing it over to you, Jack.
Well, I have to say, every time I look at these, I'm totally blown away by how diverse the approaches and particularly the deliveries are. The play with words, the play with movement, and the play with sound are very obvious and very clear in all of them. But I look at things like Twosies and the simplicity almost, I want to say minimal, but it's not minimal at all. Um, but it is very, 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 very pared down and extreme at the same time. Um, and the other thing that I really respond to in Elliot's work is this non compliance to like a linear or logical progression of ideas. It's just letting the picture and the image and the sound and the feeling carry it. And as a performer, and as a visual artist, I always think of some of my early training. I think it may have been Yvonne Rainier, like one of the postmoderns, who said that dance and cinema have in common that they are both arts of time and motion. And I don't think that's limited to I mean, I think painting, I think sculpture, everything. But I think these two practices, particularly because of their visceral and physical and material and tactile nature, means that time and particularly deterioration of things and movement, which also involves like the coming, but particularly the leaving and going and disappearing of things. And so the lens of the exhibition, this longing vessel, also becomes something that largely introduced me to Elliot and Elliot's work, and also having the great pleasure to actually be there in the exhibition physically, and not virtually, which is a rare thing to do at this point. So I know. I mean, we've had a great time talking, and I know from my experiences, like showcasing one's work also creates this level of exhaustion um, and also a potential of being confounded. And so I wanted to do this as chit chat. Chit chat is my favorite means of communication. Um, it seems petty, like little, but then like these things that come to your brain. I like that exercise of the three word, just coming up with the first three words because it is very challenging. And so, with that said, I'm curious actually to know with Elliot, what kind of um, changes happen to you when you're watching your work with other people?
All right. Well, before I answer that, I just want to say thank you so much again, Jack. It's really great to have been able to make your acquaintance and start to get to know you over the past, I guess, like month or so. And then I want to thank Issa, Cheyenne, and Dayon as well for helping organize this event. Um, yes, this whole event has been kind of a huge experiment. I'm glad that we were able to figure out how to host the videos as like a separate link outside of this because there's been some really ghoulish experiences of trying to screen share videos. Um, but I only say that because I'm having a hard time personally reflecting on what it means to show work in public because I know that like there's an audience here, but like I'm still trying to grapple as someone who works in performance and sort of does a lot of things in front of people normally, like what it can mean to have a screening or have a performance or any kind of event um, with an audience. Uh, but short answer, it feels good. I'm glad that we could all gather and kind of have this conversation. And I also second the fact that chit chat is kind of the best way to go through this work. Um, I guess before I hand it back to you, I just want to say that the approach in these videos and also a third work that will be posted or hosted online at the same link after this talk were kind of ways where I was starting to stretch and kind of explore my relationship to video, my relationship to performance, given the current restrictions, and sort of trying to find ways to use, I guess, like my hallmarks of my practice, which normally are very like immediate and of the moment, and trying to bring some of that same joy and experimentation and sort of like presence and liveness to a pre-recorded format. So I think the two videos that I shared in this short program were my work in trying to put my stamp as a performer onto video, which is kind of a fixed medium.
It's like so much. I'm going to try and control my exuberance here because there's a lot. There's a lot, and I feel that one of the points of a presentation like this is really that it is an introduction. And so I hope this will be our way for opening doors to further and longer and deeper conversations. But I am curious about, well, we both have very, very, very similar crossings. And it's very interesting the way that life can do that is kind of putting people on the same plane that have so much in common. And one of the things that I'm thinking about particularly is our performing and performance backgrounds. And I feel that we probably have come to that in different ways. My formal training was in dance, but I grew up in a very musical family and a musical background. I had musicians in my house all the time. I played like cornet badly in junior high school, and am now coming back to music with a band we call Nyobs, is a quartet. Um, and so I'm looking, but what I'm curious about is how you put that together. This idea, I came to age artistically in the '80s, and there were certain words that me and my colleagues, friends, choked over, and one of them was the term performance art, because we felt this was a thing that you did, and the reason that you did it is because there was no other word for it, and it was outside of the medium. It was outside of like any kind of generic terminology. So all of the things about encapsulating and containing and controlling performance becoming. So we would say performance, and kind of leave this open generic idea of performing as an action, as a condition, as opposed to something that came into a category that could put. And so I'm curious, like coming from a performing arts background, how or if you even feel that kind of like crossing or tension.
That's a great question. So my background originally was in music. My grandmother taught me how to play the piano, and then I played piano and did recitals all through high school. And then when I was a senior in high school, I applied to art college. So I went to school at the Art Institute of Chicago for a year and dropped out. And then just have been working on my own practice for over a decade now, which feels really cool to say. But yeah, thinking about performance art, like definitely it's a very convenient title at this moment in time. And I'm glad that with my work in this longing vessel, I'm kind of able to like flex a few different muscles and think of like performance and sort of performativity as like a tool that can be stretched beyond just the live moment and like as a way to kind of communicate through objects and with objects to a public. Uh, I think someone that I want to shout out right now is George Lewis, who's like an amazing composer, writer, academic, is at Columbia right now. But I had a meeting with him, sort of like talking about my work last year, and he actually called me a modernist, like with love. But I reflected on that and was like, oh yeah, like a lot of my approach is actually like a very like 20th century approach, like sort of like my politics and sort of like maybe my aesthetic or my style are really contemporary, but this notion of working from like a score, this notion of working from sort of these structured, almost like very, traditional kind of like minimal or even like conceptual ways of working are something that's carried over to the way that I think now, where if I think of the performance moment as a as a laboratory or like as a place for experimentation, what's most exciting to me as a maker is thinking about how to sort of set the parameters. And once I start a show or make a work, it's like kind of all bets are off. I just like allow all of the different things I have set against each other to kind of like play themselves out until the work is finished. Which I feel like is in conversation with people like Yvonne Rainer or John Cage or Benjamin Patterson, Yoko Ono, like a lot of like Fluxus, sort of like early conceptualist makers, Saul LeWitt. So um, to bring it back, I think that what I bring now as terms of performance to my practice is definitely thinking about the score and sort of, I have a very sequential approach to my way of making. Even if the work sort of like feels loose in the end, it's sort of the joy of making for me comes out of sort of being like, oh, like what if I made a performance for no audience? Or like, what if, I just had animation and nothing on screen? It's like a way for me to kind of explore these constraints that feels generative and creative and exciting as a maker.
So that brings me to Twosies. This is now like the fourth, maybe fifth time that I've seen it. And every time I look at it, the musicality comes out more and more. Um, Especially early, well, throughout the piece, there's a horn.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's percussive. Um, and then there are word pictures, I think, or picture words, depending on how you want to look at it. But there's rhythm to them, and then there's also a visual construction to them that brings out one of the other thoughts that I'm having about this way of approaching things, which is synesthesia. So this idea of sound and touch and smell and body, like all of the senses where they cross over, and I feel like Tuesdays is like a particular place where that happens because again it seems very simple and to the point, but really the more I see it, the more complex I get to it. There's certain word pictures that, of course, become prominent to me. And then, I find myself resisting the literalness of, trying to look at things literally, because some of them are common and some maybe not. And so I think, it's like one of the things that stick out in my sense memory is booty bump.
Mm,
It's like
yeah,
such a good word. It's like such a good what is the word when what it sounds like is actually what it is.
that's onomatopoeia, right? I think.
Onomatopoeia.
Yeah,
I think we talked a little bit about that.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so as a performance, as a visual work, like what is happening to you when you're looking at that? And then of course it's digital, so then you have this whole element of moving image, and cinema, cinema art.
Mhm.
um, and so for you as a performer, this is one of the other things that happened to me as a dancer, is that I started, like, my earliest involvement was more or less around, not exclusively, but this idea of documenting the
Sure.
performance. The idea is like film. It was really before video was really in common practice. And so even though, kind of coming from this multimedia, Germanic, Gesamtkunstwerk background of using the moving image as an element in the performance, it was also primarily utilized as a documentation. And so being introduced to documentation, and this is the other thing that I'm wondering if you have this experience, that when you look at something like Tuesdays, do you feel that you're playing it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, those are a lot of really great thoughts. Tuesdays is a lot of fun for me to revisit now as a viewer, like after having had made it. It's evocative, it's provocative, but it's also, I think, like freakishly simple. And I say freakishly because normally there's so much spectacle in a lot of the work that I enjoy making, whether it's like many bodies in the performance, or it's like a lot of color or energy and sort of life. And like Tuesdays is a way for me to sort of like strip all of that away. And I think you really picked up on something. It's Tuesdays is an attempt at sort of performing text. It falls short of being a song. It falls like, it's not quite a poem either, but sort of like laying this in between space. And just by centering the voice and sort of like centering the sort of very explosive and disruptive sort of like dub, siren, horn, emergency sound, it becomes like kind of a dirge in a way. Like there's a rhythmic element to it as well, where it's kind of like plodding and like trudging along. And something I wanted to highlight too visually in that work is that the style of animation I'm using is meant to sort of emulate the titles that go on news stations, where it sort of has like, it'll cut to like a different person who's like doing a presentation or whatever. Or not a presentation, they're reporting, they're reporters, but it's like their name kind of slides across on the bottom. So I'm using a stock animation that was designed to emulate that. And at the time I made that work, which was in, I think, late April, early May of last year, it felt like a bit of a revolt or against, or kind of like a rejection of this sort of constant dirge of like headlines, insurrections, violence, person dead, this thing's happening. I'm just like, okay, like these things that are super important and, well, I guess leave their mark on like American history and global history, like as a result of this pandemic, but also as a result of so many other things, like are kind of becoming abstract in my mind. And sort of, I began to, I guess, disassociate a little bit. I mean, of course, I was watching the news, but Tuesdays is sort of kind of a reaction to this feeling of like assault in a way.
Mm,
And I'm kind of recreating like an auditory assault with the horn.
mm, mm,
There's a bit of my personality, there's a bit of humor in like the text that I'm using, but it's also a bit relentless and kind of sinister in a way. Leaving the background black, in my opinion, it sort of hints at you kind of keep waiting for an image to reveal itself, and it doesn't. And you also keep reading the text to be like, okay, but like, is there a story? Is there a moment where this kind of like turns, like clicks inside my head, and like the text kind of resists all of that, which is a feeling I have sort of living through this present moment, right? It's like one thing, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. It's endless. It's an assault, and sort of like it's actually deeply physical too, like the experience of kind of consuming all this information and consuming all this news. Yeah.
So I want to now lead that into internal recreation, because it's another kind of a performance. It's clearly musical, but then I feel like we start entering into this territory of maybe acting, maybe not. That is something that I'm also seeing in your performing, is persona and personality. And so, I mean, it's super, super rock star. You know, at the same time, I'm seeing endurance. I'm seeing like endurance, and like this idea that you are putting yourself way, way, way on the line, but at the same time, I feel like still keeping this control that an actor would have in terms of keeping the character, even that the character is wild. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so it kind of makes me bridge onto a lot of things, which has to do with identity. Um, you, um, I think, were like had a lot of formation in Los Angeles, which is where you previously were before coming to New York. So that kind of LA, New York situation and how that plays out into rock and roll, particularly, it's like my knee jerk reaction was like, oh, punk.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I look at it, I'm like, well, it's really more new wave. I think musically, like new wave. Um, you know, Regardless, the character, the performance, what's going on for you in a piece like that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I hope to continue to express a kind of like punk attitude through the type of work that I'm making. Before now, like both with these videos and also with my work that's at the Studio Museum exhibition at PS1, the Songing Vessel, I think I've been able to exercise a different kind of restraint while also still showcasing my personality. But I used to be really mean, like in performance settings, like coming from a very DIY experimental tradition. It's like I have countless stories of times I've like, broken glass in galleries. Like one time I flooded a basement with ammonia, like done a lot of things with like particles, like sort of like trying to sort of through the act of performance, flipping this deep emotional experience outside of myself into the audience. But now through a mix of personal growth, but also like development in my practice, this same kind of energy and sort of like destructive spirit has sort of like focused, and like it went from becoming like a spray, like a shotgun, and it's like now more of like a laser. So I think there's still like an element of like wanting to restructure traditions, sort of like establish myself as a maker who sort of like participating within the forms of contemporary art, but also incorporating like my own personal history, but with the goal of kind of like showcasing realness or emotion or like liveness, or sort of like the kind of like immediacy and like deep visceral experience that can only be encountered through the beautiful art of performance. And for me, like performance and performativity extends to like film, to music, to literature, basically all these art forms that require someone to sit down and wait, right? It's like the story or like the art is something that doesn't really reveal itself until the end, and the
Mm-hmm.
art doesn't exist until you've kind of gone from point A to point B, and then point C is internal. It's like when you've had a moment to reflect on everything that happened. And sort of that's how I feel like my interest in like energy or experience is sort of
Mm.
different from the traditional plastic arts canon, which is more about like, does this fit on a wall? Y/N. Like, can I put it on a pedestal? Y/N. And two, that's even changed for me because I used to be so adamant about like asserting myself as just a performance, but now I've even progressed even more to someone who does make objects and figuring out like how can I create like a space where the hallmarks of liveness or the hallmarks of experimentation can still translate back to the plastic or the physical object. Um, so yes, I think like punk is spot on, new wave is spot on. Like I before moving to Los Angeles, I was performing a lot of uh, DIY like warehouse shows in Chicago, and ended up being able to tour to Japan and other places like through my music practice. And then in 2015, Dr. Lauren Deland, who's like an art historian, curated me into a program co-produced by the Walker Art Center that was for it was like the 21st anniversary of the Culture Wars, which were sort of these series of performances that happened, like people like Ron Athey, Karen. Oh my God, why am I forgetting her name? She did the performance with the Yams. She was at NYU for a long time. You probably know Jack.
Oh,
Karen
is
Finley.
Karen, yeah, Karen.
Yeah, Karen Finley. But basically, like, and a few other folks, but sort of like their performance art and sort of like creative practice were like weaponized, like in the Senate, I think, as sort of a reason for conservative lawmakers to repeal NEA arts funding. So yes, Holly Hughes to Miller. Yeah, thank you, Carl. I saw that in the chat. Um, so I was brought in as sort of like a younger generation of artists who's like making kind of anti-establishment sort of like performance artwork in conversation with that lineage. And it was from there that I met Ron Athey, who's also one of my good friends and mentors, Amelia Jones, who's a fantastic art historian, Jennifer Doyle, who's also done really great writing, and sort of they were my being able to make contact with them and to show my work in that context through the Walker Art Center and also link back to history kind of gave me the confidence to move to LA and continue to pursue performing. So I moved there, lived there for 6 years, and then applied for the Studio Museum residency. And now I've been in New York for a year and a half. So yeah, I only bring up this little bit of personal history to say that like that kind of like punk energy and spirit definitely like runs deep, but the way that it mixes with contemporary art and sort of like this lineage that's continuing started before me and like will continue after something that I
Right.
really value. Yeah,
Well, personal, is, as they say, political, and
absolutely.
definitely things inform us. Because I was thinking about Ron Athey, I was thinking about Rick Castro, especially Vaginal. Um,
Vaginal Davis is like, oh my god, if you are watching Vaginal Davis, you're my favorite. You know that already, but yeah, she's one of my favorite people on earth. So
yeah.
cool. Yeah.
And so what you're talking about, this idea of like that difference or gradation of like a harshness, um, camera faller, I'm thinking
Mm.
of, and that LA, New York thing where you kind of associate West Coast LA with like easygoing, but then you have some of the most extreme, Karen Finley, and on and on and on.
Mm.
And so being like the embodiment of like those coasts and the middle
Yep.
is is incredible. And I feel like what we're doing is very nicely slipping into a next segment that I think we talked about a little bit in terms of like performance, like the idea of Western performance being very new in culture with this idea of specialization. And I think you talked a little bit about like the ritual aspect of creativity, and this idea that like of some people are watching and passive, and then there are other people who are active and are the ones who bring. And I think that is a natural thing in culture because you do have the facilitators, you do have the shaman, and so forth and so forth and so on. But at the same time, this idea that music, particularly um, theater, the idea of watching, and I think in a lot of religion, like the idea of call and response, which I've seen in the work, in other work of yours, um, so that, I guess what we call a chorus, like a body,
Mm-hmm.
and where the spectator is not necessarily passive or disengaged. And so we have, like, this, that happens, or whatever, like the traditional separation of, like, Q&A, which is what I'm leading up to, is the idea of how a conversation can also be opened, in such a way that it is not necessarily binary,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so kind of feeling our connections with people, with
Right.
some of the people that you mentioned, um, and especially this idea that I felt this immediate bond with you. I think part of it is generational, because the older you get, the more familiarity you have with humanity. I think other people, in my generation, can speak for their experience of that. But the idea that everyone, that you've met everyone somehow, and like the persona. But I think also we carry, like, with the people that we meet and the people who we may not physically meet but influence us, and that is also becomes this other, binding factor.
Sure.
So I don't really feel like any of that made any sense.
Oh my God, Jack, it made so much sense. And I also was thinking too, like, before you started talking, that like to add you, Jack Waters, and also like Ishmael Houston Jones and so many other folks, like
Yes.
I'm kind of seeing the
Yes.
chat. It's the same. It's like a generational thing. Like it's very LA and also New York, but it's like not restricted to those places. Um, I don't know. I was seeing names pop up in the chat, and I was like, yes, that person, absolutely. But yeah, to respond to what you're saying, I think that it did not feel that way when I dropped out of school. I thought I was gonna die, like literally like folding t-shirts at Urban Outfitters for $8.25 an hour and be like, this is it. Like I will die here. My life is over. But I think a gift that I was given through these spaces that were sort of outside of like museums, outside of traditional funding structures, sort of gave me the gift to connect to people on like a peer-to-peer basis, and also working with music, in this very immediate way, right? Because it's like music is a party, and I love that you like also brought up like a religious ceremony, or sort of like this notion of the chorus as being an extended body, like the congregation is a body, and I absolutely agree with that and believe that. But I think music, which makes it kind of different from art, is that like it requires the chorus, it requires the audience. People are on stage or they're on the floor or whatever, but like the experience of encountering music in a live setting is the experience of sort of like feeling people kind of lay it out on the line, whether it's like they're squeezing out all of their breath, to play a horn, or they're singing or like making sound, with the physical body that becomes, audio waves, and it's like, transmuted into pleasure, right? Or communication or language or something into the bodies of the audience. And that, like being able to kind of build my experience as an artist within that space has and like forever will influence how I think about sharing art in galleries and museums, probably until the day that I die, and hopefully a long time afterwards. Because I have a sensitivity and a consideration for sort of how the viewer encounters the work that doesn't come from this sort of I make this joke a lot, but whatever, most people in the room haven't heard it, but like this sort of European or like Renaissance like ideal of what it means to be an artist, right? Where you're just like sitting in the dark by candlelight, sketching, and then like one day like Lord whoever like buys your drawing, and then like you have a patron and then you die. It's like, no, like I've always been really like in it, and sort of like it's been about people, it's been about making generational bonds, sort of social bonds, and also coming from an experimental kind of DIY space. It's like we can only tour by like supporting each other, right? Like the fact that I got to like go to Asia and go to Europe and around the US just like based on like peer-to-peer contact, and like not through a gallery or like a booker, is very special. And I think that it comes from a kind of older tradition in a way. Like I mean, I'm sure I'm wrong, but it does sometimes feel like you can't do anything now without having a booker or like a gallery or an agent. I
I'm
don't really believe that, but sometimes it feels that way.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think of that a lot. This idea of what you can and what you can't do, and particularly around words. And a lot of times I hear this with generations about like, especially words that are generational, like appropriated words like queer. There are people that, or gender expression that is very, people in my generation, who will say, I can't do this and I can't do that. And my response is that yes, you can do whatever you want, but you're going to be answerable to it.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that like you will get like feedback, from what you do and what you say doesn't mean you can't do it. So I feel like what you're saying, yes, we live in very conservative, very restrictive times. And so this is what I beg of people is to think that when you have this gut impulse, when you have an inclination, and you feel, and it's interesting you also bring up Europe because I had this experience. One of our collaborators, when we were doing like this dance performance troupe, and we were in Zurich, and we were like in a park, and we're sitting with our partner Krista, and Peter and I start doing yoga, and Krista said, "Oh, well, you can do that here because you're foreigners. You don't live here, but I can't." Meaning that if she did it, she would be totally revived. Like, I mean, it would basically be
Ridiculed.
like the scar, yeah, like the scarlet horror for doing something inappropriate in public, which would be yoga. And and so it seems it sounds silly, but they are very strict. There are like these strictures, and I don't want to pick on Switzerland, although Switzerland is a perfect example for levels of repression. Um, but do you know what I'm saying? Is that you actually can. And I think that's where community comes in, because when you find yourself surrounded by people who have your back, as you have through your mentors, through your elders, and especially through your generation. I had a similar experience when I was teaching at Hampshire, and I was like, where's the student? Like there were some like fucked up things happening, in what was a bastion of American liberalism and progressive education. And I'm not going to go into it, but the point was that like it's like, well, where's the student movement? This is like
Yeah.
early 2000s, and people and my students were the same age as my friends, so I sort of transgressed this boundary of maturity, I guess. But they would say, well, we can't because no one is going to have my back. Like if I protest or dissent, I cannot be sure that I'm going to have people behind me. And I said, this is like a generational thing, that there is that it's been eradicated. And I think what we're seeing now, with Black Lives Matters, with queer liberation marches, and so forth and so on, is again like this galvanization and unification of people who feel like, well, there is a community, and that community
Mm-hmm.
like transgress it, like transfers over generation and over gender, and it's hard, and you do need support. And I feel it's conversations like this where we can talk to each other. um, I see Jim Farad is here. Carl George, like they're some of the most courageous pioneers that I know in my experience. um, and I feel like generationally this is where we are now, where we are coming with this new level of leadership and unity. And I don't mean from an individual point, but like people and groups that can bring us back together, so that we can now have the strength to say, well, yeah, we can, yeah, we can, we can do this.
Yeah, I'm
And
gonna clap emoji for that.
yeah, but I feel like this is where we kind of open up the party. Like this is where we have the party, and we bring other voices in. Yes.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In spite of, not being able to have this conversation in person, I feel like this acted as a bridge in so many ways. bridging audience members wherever they might be, bridging Jack, your downtown community, with Elliot's residency uptown, and of course, generations. So
Mhm.
I want to bring in a question from one of our audience members. They ask, and this is a question for both Elliot and Jack, what does it mean to speak across generations? And in particular, what it means or has meant to have elders in both the sense of community and in the sense of art practice.
Oh my God, I want to go first. Basically, I learned that everyone's lying. People lie so much. And like, to be real, like, they don't know better, but just like, kind of like what Jack was saying too, like, until I met people who like were actually doing the thing, like, especially coming from like a college environment where people lie to you and be like, oh, you have to like, you can't get to step D unless you do step A and step B first. But in reality, sometimes you have to do like step Q, step like M.4, step like negative C before you get to step B, you know? So I think elders and sort of like both intergenerational or intra-generational, like people my age who are just doing stuff they love to do, and also seeing people who are older through my own research and kind of experiences, being like, oh, okay, wait, like you actually can, you know, being an artist doesn't mean what I thought it meant to be an artist. And also like, um, this is an aside. I'm not bringing any of the people I actually love into this conversation, but like to throw early conceptual art under the bus a little bit is like through some of my research, I learned that like in school, a lot of the people I was taught as being sort of like geniuses or like the gods of like modern thinking. It's like when you read their interviews or read their autobiographies, you realize it was a bunch of like 20 somethings like on heroin, like literally.
Right.
So it's like,
Right.
okay, like
Right.
the way that people talk about things looking back is like one moment, but just like I thought these people were gods like from jump, you know, because that's how it was talked about. But it was like, ooh, wait a second, actually, like no one actually knows what's going on. It sort of
Right.
takes like a bit of looking back to sort of contextualize.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you would mention like the uptown downtown town relationship because Alan and I are actually neighbors. Like we both live in the same neighborhood. Although yes, the studio museum is uptown, and it is a good distinction, and certainly a bridge. But in terms of elders, yeah, what makes me think of my training as a dancer was at modern dance, who were all of these old, basically like old ladies who lived in what's now my neighborhood. And so they were talking about the Henry Street settlement. They would talk about like Second Street, like all of these things that were like the grounds of their like performing and training. And to me, it was mythological, like the idea of the Lord. And in fact, my earliest experience of this neighborhood was horrifying. I mean, it was like mid mid 70s. I first came, and I think I must have been like Avenue A, like 7th and A, and it was the scariest experience I've ever had in my life. Like the heroin, the drugs. Later, when I moved here, I learned, oh, well, it's like if you're not in the drug trade, like, or needing it, it's not really like dangerous. It's like just another level of commerce and experience. Not a happy one, and certainly not a healthy one by any means, but not that kind of mythological other that I had been oriented to in terms of being an outsider, essentially, so that my mentors basically came of age. And it was at an earlier time, before white flight, before like the deterioration of like the urban center. But at the same time, it was also, there was another generation. There were like other generations of immigrants that I suppose, relatively speaking, would have made it equally scary. And here were my mentors creating their art that I would later come to find as my own actual developing ground. So that's the relationship to my mentors, is like having people like Anna Sokolow and Doris Humphrey, and all of these people who were like the pioneers of the American modern dance. Um, and it was all coming up through the Lower East Side, which is now the East Village, but
Mhm.
that's a whole other story.
Thank you. Let's move on to a question from Peter Kramer. He asks, actually, Peter, would you like to share this question out loud?
Peter, your mic's not on.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
I was hoping it would be just presented, but I can keep my anonymity with my little Cupid doll.
Just
Um,
what am I doing?
Question was, let's see if I can recall it. It has to do with this period that we're in now of um, of wokeness and what it is. Just your musings or thoughts on being in this moment where um, the focus, the spotlight has been put on the African American experience and people of color by museums, galleries, you know, websites, and what that means to you. Um, yes, that's it. Either as, something that encourages you, or does it feel like, oh, you know, like this is so late. This is, you know,
Yeah,
I don't know. I just wanted to know if
for
you
sure.
had any.
I mean, I just want to say I'm here for the intersectional moments between this conversation, like all of the everything that's happening is absolutely merited, and in no way do I think that these conversations should stop happening. And until real change happens, I don't think it's going to be over. So, I mean, short answer, like, yes. I know that's not like grammatically correct to your question, but like, yes to all of that. And I don't even think that I'm going to refute it. Like, I know that there's a lot of criticism about like, oh, like the air is being sucked out of the room, or just like, people getting canceled or whatever. But I kind of feel that there needs to be a lot more noise made before like the next epoch or like the next like way of talking about these issues happens, and I feel like we haven't quite gotten there yet. So I'm glad that at least at this moment in time it feels like some of the frustration can kind of bubble to the surface.
Where do you feel we are right now with that? Because I feel like there was like an intensity of things coming to the surface and almost popping, and then receding. And I know there are a lot of other mitigating factors like the pandemic and like the presidency, I guess. I don't know.
The
What do you
presidency, I guess, is right. It's just like what, like
yeah.
very shades of gray with that one.
Do you feel like you have a bead on like is it even possible to be able to take a pulse?
I think it's possible to take a pulse, as in the body is definitely still breathing, but I can't really catch a beat.
Hmm.
If that makes sense.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
And then also too to like shout out Legacy Russell. I forget who she quoted, but or I saw something on her Instagram that maybe she reposted that was kind of like, um, the future is going to be both like better and worse than we
Mm,
imagined. I don't
mm,
know whose quote that was, but I
mm,
feel like that's kind of the moment we're in now. Like
mm,
the closet still hasn't been emptied out completely, but
mm.
I think going forward, we'll be able to benefit from it, but also like the true like insidiousness or evilness of it, like will continue to reveal itself. But hey, I haven't been struck down yet by the hand of God or some other malevolent force. So I guess I have a golden pass to keep working. Whoever decides that, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, though that always reminds me of that Swedenborg thing where they were talking about, he was talking about the apocalypse, and he said, "Oh, the apocalypse already happened in the spiritual world." So this idea of being like stricken, this idea of like what our realities are and what our physical and material realities are in terms of their relativity is also very interesting. And I think that's also where things where like race and gender come into play. I think it was Laverne. There was a dialogue between Laverne Cox and Bell Hooks at the New School, and in the conversation, Laverne said, "No one is as white as they think they are." And so it's kind of become like this cause for me in a lot of ways of like, why are you so white? Like why like why? And it becomes a choice. I think because passing is passing in a lot of ways and privilege is privilege. And so accessing things if you can, I think goes largely unconsciously. And so I think this whole notion of wokeness, I think that phrase itself starts to become another one of these appropriations. They get hackneyed very quickly, or they have the propensity to. And I always think of my experience with like what we thought was going to be a revolution. And Angela Davis, Kathleen Cleaver, and I think sex and sexuality. I mean, these like really sexy women, and like the idea of their bodies also being like a battleground and an area of expression. The hair, and then like the literal paraphernalia, like we're not wearing gun belts because it looks cool, and then 2 minutes later it's in Vanity Fair. It's in Vogue. So this like look, who is it that coined the term radical chic? So this idea of so-called dominant culture appropriating the expressions and the tools of resistance, it happens very, 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 very quickly. And I think this is where our language and our words and our actions and our images start to come into play. And I feel our bodies are the first level of expression.
I want to bring in this last question from Legacy Russell, our associate curator. Legacy says, I'm wondering, Elliot and Jack, if you could speak a bit to the question of faith in this moment, most particularly because there's so much about longing that is entangled with questions of faith, a sort of hoping for something to materialize, even when we can't see it.
Take it away, Jack.
Actually, I think about this a lot. Um, Faith and belief are very interesting because the very notion of faith is that you have faith. The very notion of faith itself is that it's not there because it's provable. And in fact, it's there because it's not provable. Belief, on the other hand, hinges on like facts, knowledge, information, statistics, and so forth. So one can believe in something and one can have faith in something at the same time, but they're not the same thing. I think faith is very powerful. um One of the things, like there like this idea that there's a gut. I grew up as an ethical humanist. There was this, technically, as a religion, but there's no emphasis on a divine being. There's no like rejection of a divine being, but that's not what it's about. It's kind of like two steps below Quakerism, I guess, if you, or Unitarian. It's kind of one of these. It's philosophical in a large way, but it's also theological. It's a lot like Amish, where you learn, part of the religion is you learn about other religions, and through your course of religious education. So you kind of understand what faith is, and it basically goes into something that's unexplainable, that it's right. We know what's the right thing. But when we come into conflict with other people, and particularly when we come into conflict with power, the right thing starts to become very tricky. And I think language has a lot to do with this. Who's governing the language? Who's governing the rules? And I talk about language, I'm talking about codes and modes of behavior. So again, where this idea of like a patriarchal white um, power structure has been going on for like hundreds of years. I don't think it's thousands. I think this is all very new. Racism um, and misogyny, I think, are relatively new in human experience, and I think a lot of that has to do with the development of trade itself, of this idea of symbolic trade, where it's not about the object, it's not about like the food itself or the how or like the material necessities, but things start to become symbolized through currency, and then speech becomes another aspect of that currency. So I think faith is very important because you have a belief in something that's not material. You say there is power, there is strength, and there is value in this thing and these things, but I cannot put my hands on it, I cannot see it, I cannot touch it, I cannot smell it, yet it is there. I believe there is a spirit. There are many spirits. Um, and accessing that, I think, is largely what Elliot was speaking to, this idea of our ancestors, of our elders, but then also of our children. Because similarly to what Laverne said, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's a statement of relativity that there's always someone older than us, and there'll always be someone younger than us. So, like, fuck whiteness. And I think that's what she was saying, really, basically, is it doesn't really exist except in this construct that has been reinforced with these like very fucked up mechanisms of control over materialism, where women, children, people of color start to become these objects of value, of assets, really. And so we now have to start rethinking about who we are in terms of being material objects to anything except to ourselves, if we want to.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Jack. I definitely agree and relate to that. And I want to mirror that. I think that I am also not. I think I know. I know I'm an extremely spiritual person, and sort of my entire art practice is sort of like uh, an extended syllogism, or just kind of like a constant transmuting of like a lot of the unsolvable points that you're bringing up, and sort of finding a way to like transmute that like through my body, and in a way working through performance and dealing with liveness as a medium is sort of like it's quite powerful, because I found a way to sort of aestheticize the one thing that no one can own, which is time. And I don't think that that's a small task to do. So I hope we don't die. We're not going to, like, anytime soon, but it's just like it's a very powerful situation to be in, and I don't take like the work of an artist lightly at all. I'm glad that I get to participate and be in conversation with like a past, a present, and a future as well.
What a powerful note to end our evening on. Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Jack, for tonight's moving, beautiful conversation. Now I want to invite Josephine Graff, Assistant Curator at MoMA PS1, to give our closing.
Thank you, Cheyenne, and thanks so much to the whole Studio Museum team for putting this gorgeous event together. And of course, a huge thank you to Elliot for sharing these new works with us tonight, and to Jack Waters for drawing out such insight into Elliot's really multifaceted practice. It was an illuminating program. I learned a lot. And I think one of your first or your three words at the beginning was beautiful, and it really was. So thank you both. As Yelena mentioned at the beginning of the program, I've had the pleasure of working with Yelena and Legacy Russell on the Studio Museum's 2019-2020 Artist in Residence exhibition, The Longing Vessel, which is currently on view at PS1 and which features Elliot's work alongside that of E. Jane and Naudeline Pierre. This is the second year of our cross-institutional collaboration, and it's been a really amazing experience to co-host these exhibitions and programs while the Studio Museum constructs their new building. So thank you on behalf of PS1 to the entire Studio Museum team. I think tonight's program offers a really brilliant entry point into and counterpart to Elliot's work on view at PS1. So for anyone who hasn't already seen The Longing Vessel in person and who might be in the New York area, and for those who have seen it and want to come back again, we invite you to come visit us and check out the show. It's up through March 14th at PS1 in Long Island City. You can reserve tickets in advance online and come visit us safely. We're open Thursday through Monday, 12 to 6 p.m. and until 8 p.m. on Saturdays. And as always, we are free for New York City residents. I also want to mention that we're hosting an exciting series of performances by Elliot titled Duets, which are taking place in a private location at PS1, actually the somewhat legendary Boiler Room, which is currently offline for the public. And these performances, like tonight's works, engage the status of liveness, of isolation, of intimacy under the conditions of the pandemic. These are occurring every other Saturday through March 6th, and they're live streamed to a monitor on site, also on the event page at MoMA.org and via the PS1 Instagram. And Elliot's invited a new guest to join him for each iteration of the performance. And the next one, which we're very excited about, will occur on February 6th from 1 to 2 p.m. with Ishmael Houston Jones. So please all come check it out. It should be an exciting one. So thank you again, Elliot and Jack, and to the entire Studio Museum team, and to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their evening.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much for Jack for joining me today.
Thank you. And I look forward to seeing everyone. I really look forward to this pandemic being over and loving to see people at our garden, Le Petit Versailles, and also at the new Studio Museum. It's really exciting. It's going to be really, 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 really exciting.
Woo! Can't wait. Thank you. Silent clap.